Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. October 30th, 2011, Devil's Night. The air carried that particular autumn chill that seemed to seep through your jacket and settle in your bones. I was 19 then, young and stupid enough to think that abandoned buildings held secrets worth risking arrest for. My boyfriend Kevin and his childhood friend Garrett had picked me up around 9 p.m., the three of us restless with that peculiar energy that comes with being young and having nowhere to be on a night when mischief feels like destiny. We drove aimlessly through the winding back roads of rural Pennsylvania, Kevin's beat-up Honda Civic struggling up the steep hills that surrounded our small town. The radio crackled with static between stations, playing fragments of songs that seemed to cut in and out like ghostly whispers. Garrett sat in the passenger seat, constantly adjusting the frequency, trying to find something that would stick. "We could hit up the old cemetery," Kevin suggested, his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the blackness, revealing nothing but asphalt and the occasional reflective eyes of some nocturnal creature watching us from the tree line. "Boring," Garrett replied, finally settling on a station playing classic rock. "We've been there a dozen times. Same broken headstones, same stories." I leaned forward from the back seat, resting my arms on the back of Kevin's seat. "What about that place you mentioned last week? The old hospital?" Garrett turned to look at me, his face illuminated by the green glow of the dashboard. "Waverly Sanitarium. That place is intense, like seriously messed up history." "Perfect," I said, feeling that familiar thrill that came with the promise of something genuinely terrifying. "What's the story?" Kevin glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Built in the 1920s for tuberculosis patients. Back then, TB was basically a death sentence. They'd bring people there to die, essentially. Families would drop off their loved ones and never see them again." "Gets worse," Garrett added, pulling out his phone to check the GPS. "After they found a cure for TB, the state converted it into a mental hospital in the 50s. You know how they treated mental patients back then. Electroshock therapy, ice baths, lobotomies, the works." A knot formed in my stomach, equal parts excitement and dread. "When did it close?" 1982, Kevin said, taking a sharp turn that sent us deeper into the mountains. "Budget cuts. They just emptied it out, left everything behind." The thought of all that suffering, all those deaths, contained within one building was both horrifying and irresistible. I had always been drawn to places where tragedy had occurred, as if I could somehow feel the echoes of past anguish in the walls themselves. It was a morbid fascination that I couldn't explain, but on Devil's Night, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "How far is it?" I asked. 20 minutes, Garrett replied, typing the address into his phone. "Fair warning, though. This isn't like the other places we've been. People who've been inside, they don't usually want to go back." Kevin nodded grimly. "My cousin went there last Halloween with some friends. Came back white as a sheet, wouldn't talk about what happened for weeks." "What did he finally tell you?" "That some places are abandoned for good reason." The town of Cresson appeared suddenly, emerging from the darkness like something from a half-remembered nightmare. Most of the streetlights were broken or turned off, leaving only a few flickering sentinels to mark our passage through the sleeping community. The few businesses that remained open cast sickly yellow light onto empty sidewalks. Kevin pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Tavern, a dive bar that looked like it had been serving the same customers since the 1970s. Through the grimy windows, I could see a handful of locals nursing beers and staring at a television mounted in the corner. The kind of place where strangers were noticed and remembered. We park here, Garrett explained as Kevin turned off the engine. Walking distance to the hospital, but far enough away that if anyone sees the car, they won't immediately connect it to trespassing. The silence that followed the dying engine was absolute. No traffic, no voices, no sounds of civilization. Even the tavern seemed muted, as if the night itself was absorbing all noise. We climbed out of the car, and immediately I felt it. That overwhelming sense of wrongness that sometimes hits you in certain places. It wasn't just the typical nervousness of doing something illegal. This was deeper, more primal. Every instinct I had was telling me to get back in the car and leave. You feel that? I asked, pulling my jacket tighter around myself. Kevin nodded, checking his flashlight. Yeah. Place has a reputation for that. People say you can feel it from a mile away. Garrett had produced a second flashlight and was testing the beam. Electromagnetic interference. Old buildings, lots of metal, underground electrical systems. Creates weird sensations. His explanation sounded reasonable, scientific, but it didn't make the feeling go away. If anything, it intensified as we began walking down the dark street toward the hospital grounds. The few streetlights we passed flickered erratically, as if struggling to stay on. After 10 minutes of walking, we reached the edge of the hospital property. A chain-link fence, partially collapsed and overgrown with dead vegetation, marked the boundary. Beyond it, the massive structure of Waverly Sanitarium loomed against the star-filled sky. Even in the darkness, the building was imposing. 4 stories of dark brick and Gothic architecture, with a central tower that stretched even higher into the night. Dozens of windows, most broken, stared down at us like dead eyes. The few that still held glass reflected our flashlight beams back at us in fragmented patterns. God, I whispered, unable to keep the awe from my voice. How many people died in there? Records show about 8,000 TB patients over 30 years, Garrett said, consulting his phone again. Nobody kept accurate records of the mental hospital years, but estimates put it around 3,000 more. 11,000 deaths. 11,000 people who had come here seeking help and found only suffering and death. The weight of that number settled over me like a heavy blanket. Kevin found a gap in the fence where someone had cut the chain link years earlier. We squeezed through one by one, officially entering the hospital grounds. The moment my feet touched the property, that sense of wrongness intensified tenfold. The grounds themselves were a maze of overgrown weeds, fallen trees, and crumbling concrete walkways. Scattered throughout were smaller buildings, what looked like maintenance sheds, a power plant, and something that might have been staff housing. But our eyes were drawn inevitably to the main building. As we approached, details became visible that made my stomach clench. Graffiti covered much of the lower walls, not just typical spray paint tags, but disturbing images and words that spoke of violence and desperation. Some windows on the ground floor had been boarded up, but many of the boards had rotted away or been torn down by previous trespassers. Look at the windows on the 3rd floor, Kevin said, pointing upward. I followed his gaze and saw them. Metal bars covering every window on what must have been the psychiatric ward. Even from the ground, I could see scratch marks in the concrete around the windows, as if desperate fingers had clawed at the stone trying to escape. We circled around to the back of the building, looking for our way inside. The rear of the hospital was even more forbidding than the front. A loading dock, probably used for bringing in supplies and removing bodies, gaped open like a wound. But the doors were sealed with newer boards and heavy chains. Here, Garrett called from beneath a ground floor window. He had found a section where the plywood covering had come loose, creating a gap just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Kevin went first, his flashlight beam disappearing into the darkness beyond the window. His voice echoed strangely as he called back to us. It's clear. Some kind of waiting room. I went next, swinging my legs through the opening and dropping down into the unknown. My feet hit solid floor, and immediately the smell hit me. decades of decay, mold, and something else underneath that I didn't want to identify. The air was thick and seemed to stick in my lungs. Garrett was just starting to climb through when disaster struck. The sound of Garrett hitting the floor rung was sickening. A wet pop followed by his sharp intake of breath and a curse that echoed through the empty room. Kevin immediately swung his flashlight toward him, revealing Garrett clutching his left knee, his face contorted in pain. "Damn it!" Garrett gasped, trying to put weight on the leg and immediately wincing. "Something twisted wrong when I came down." "How bad is it?" I asked, kneeling beside him while Kevin kept the light steady. "Bad enough." He tested the knee gingerly, managing to stand but clearly favoring the injured leg. "Feels like I pulled something, maybe tore a ligament." Kevin and I exchanged glances. We had just gotten inside, and already something had gone wrong. In the horror movies I loved, this would be the moment when the smart characters turned around and left. But we weren't smart characters. We were 19 years old and stupid with curiosity. "We should go back," Kevin said, though I could hear the reluctance in his voice. "No." Garrett's response was immediate and firm. "I'm not ruining this for everyone. I can walk. It just hurts. Let's at least look around a little." While they debated, I took the opportunity to examine the room we had entered. Kevin's flashlight provided limited illumination, but I could make out the basic layout. We were in what had clearly been a waiting area, probably where families said their final goodbyes to loved ones being admitted to die. The room was large, maybe 30 feet by 20, with high ceilings that disappeared into darkness above us. Chairs were stacked along the walls in haphazard piles, as if someone had tried to clean up but given up halfway through. Most were old metal folding chairs, but there were a few upholstered pieces that had been ravaged by time, moisture, and rodents. In the center of the room sat a wheelchair, an old-fashioned model with large wheels and a rigid frame. Unlike everything else in the room, it sat perfectly upright and positioned, as if someone had just gotten up from it moments before. The sight of it sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. "That's weird," I said, pointing to the wheelchair. Kevin swung his light toward it. "What?" "Everything else is stacked up or pushed against the walls. Why is that sitting in the middle of the room like someone just parked it there?" We stared at the wheelchair for a long moment. In the shifting shadows created by our flashlight beams, it almost seemed to rock slightly as if moved by some unfelt breeze. "Wind through the windows," Kevin said, but he didn't sound convinced. "There's no wind," Garrett pointed out. He had managed to stand and was testing his mobility. "I can walk. It hurts, but I can walk. Let's keep going." Kevin led the way to what appeared to be the room's main exit, a set of double doors that hung slightly open. Beyond them stretched a corridor that seemed to extend indefinitely into the darkness. Our flashlight beams could only penetrate about 20 feet before being swallowed by the black. The hallway was wide enough for gurneys to pass each other, and the floors were covered in linoleum that had once been white but was now stained and cracked. Water damage had created abstract patterns on the walls where paint had peeled away in long strips. Every few feet, doorways opened off the main corridor. Patient rooms, offices, treatment areas. "Stay close," Kevin warned as we began to move deeper into the building. "It's easy to get turned around in here." I positioned myself between Kevin and Garrett, close enough to benefit from Kevin's flashlight while trying to help Garrett navigate in the dimmer light of my smaller light. Every step echoed strangely in the corridor, the sounds seeming to bounce off walls and return to us changed, distorted. The first few rooms we passed were empty except for debris, broken furniture, piles of rotting fabric that might have been bedding, and scattered papers. But as we progressed deeper into the hospital, we began to encounter rooms that told more disturbing stories. One room contained what looked like restraint devices, metal brackets bolted to walls, leather straps hanging from a metal bed frame, a straitjacket crumpled in one corner. The walls were covered in scratch marks, some shallow, others deep enough to have drawn blood from whoever made them. "Isolation room," Garrett said, reading from a sign beside the door. "For violent patients." "Violent or just desperate?" I murmured, running my finger along one of the deeper scratch marks. The concrete was worn smooth in places, suggesting someone had worked at it for a very long time. Another room held filing cabinets, most of them tipped over and emptied. Patient files were scattered across the floor, some water-damaged beyond reading, others intact enough to reveal fragments of human tragedy. I knelt and picked up a file at random. The name had been redacted, but I could make out enough details to paint a horrifying picture. A 16-year-old girl admitted in 1958 for hysteria and violent episodes. The treatment notes described months of electroshock therapy, forced sedation, and isolation. The final entry, dated 6 months after admission, simply read, "Patient expired during treatment. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. 16 years old. Younger than I was now." "Jesus," I whispered, then caught myself. God, she was just a kid. Kevin looked over my shoulder at the file. "They're all like that. Kids, mostly. People whose only crime was being different or inconvenient." We had been walking for maybe 20 minutes when we reached a section of the hospital that was clearly different from what we had seen so far. The corridor opened into a larger area, what might have been a nurse's station or administrative center. Desks were overturned, filing cabinets emptied, and papers scattered everywhere like fallen leaves. But unlike the other rooms, this area showed signs of deliberate destruction. Burn marks scorched the floor in several places, and piles of ash suggested that someone had tried to destroy evidence of what had happened here. "They tried to burn the records," Garrett observed, poking at one of the ash piles with his good foot. "Probably when they closed the place down." "Why would they do that?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "To hide what they did to people," Kevin replied grimly. "Some of these treatment methods, they weren't just ineffective, they were torture." I began examining the files that had survived the attempted burning. Most were water-damaged or partially charred, but enough remained readable to piece together a horrifying picture of life in Waverly Sanitarium during its years as a mental hospital. One file described hydrotherapy treatments that involved forcing patients into ice-cold baths for hours at a time. Another detailed lobotomy procedures performed on patients as young as 14. A third documented experimental drug trials that had killed 6 patients in a single month. But it was the photographs that really got to me. Tucked into the back of one file folder were a series of black and white photographs that showed the hospital during its operational years. Patients strapped to beds, their eyes vacant with medication or terror. Treatment rooms with equipment that looked more like torture devices than medical instruments. And the staff, doctors and nurses who looked at their patients not with compassion, but with the cold detachment of people studying lab rats. One photograph showed what appeared to be a group therapy session, but the patients were all wearing straitjackets and most had visible injuries, black eyes, split lips, bandaged heads. The caption on the back read, "Behavioral Modification Session, October 1961. "Look at this," I called to the others, holding up another photograph. This one showed the basement level of the hospital. Rows of beds filled a long, low-ceilinged room. But these weren't treatment beds. They were more like prison cots, close together and surrounded by bars. The caption read, "Violent Patient Containment Area." "There's a basement," Kevin said, studying the photo. "We should check it out." "Are you insane?" Garrett asked. "This place is horrifying enough above ground." But I found myself drawn to the idea. If the upper floors had been this disturbing, what secrets lay below? What had they hidden in the basement that couldn't be done in the rooms above? As I was putting the photographs back in the file, my flashlight illuminated something else scattered among the papers. Personal items that had belonged to patients. A child's stuffed animal, moth-eaten and gray with age. A wedding ring, tarnished black. A leather diary with pages so fragmented I could only make out individual words. Help, home, please, God. The diary belonged to someone named Catherine. She had been admitted in 1959 at age 17 for manic episodes and inappropriate behavior. The few readable entries painted a picture of a frightened young woman who had been abandoned by her family and subjected to increasingly harsh treatments. I tried to tell Dr. Reynolds that the medicine makes me sick, one entry read. But he says I'm being difficult. They put me in the quiet room again yesterday. It's not quiet at all. There are sounds in the walls. Another entry dated several weeks later. They did the electric treatment again today. I can't remember things anymore. I know I had a sister, but I can't remember her name. I think they're trying to make me forget who I am. The final entry, barely legible. Something is wrong here. People go to the basement and don't come back. I can hear them crying at night, but when I ask the nurses, they say nobody is crying. I think I'm next. If someone finds this, please tell my family I tried to come home. I closed the diary, my hands shaking. Catherine would have been about my age when she wrote those words. She had been someone's daughter, someone's sister, and she had died in this place, alone and terrified. We need to keep moving, Kevin said softly. He had been reading over my shoulder, and I could see that the files were affecting him too. This is getting too heavy. But as we prepared to leave the area, I noticed something else. Many of the surviving files mentioned the basement level, but always in vague terms. Patient transferred to lower level for intensive treatment. Experimental procedures conducted in sub-basement facility. Specialized containment protocols enacted. Whatever had happened in the basement of Waverly Sanitarium, the staff had been careful not to document it clearly, which only made me more curious about what we might find down there. We left the records area and continued deeper into the hospital, following signs that pointed toward the main treatment wing. This section of the building felt different from what we had seen so far, more clinical, more deliberately designed for suffering. The first room we entered contained equipment that made my blood run cold. Metal tables with restraint straps, cabinets full of surgical instruments, many of them rusted but still recognizably sharp. And in one corner, a machine that looked like something from a science fiction movie, all wires and dials and metal plates. Electroshock therapy, Garrett said, limping over to examine the device. They'd strap patients down and run electrical current through their brains. The machine was connected to a metal headpiece that looked like a medieval torture device. Leather straps dangled from it, and I could see stains on the metal that I preferred not to think about. Nearby, a chart on the wall showed treatment schedules. Some patients were listed for daily sessions. Daily? I said, reading the chart. They did this to people every day? For weeks at a time, Kevin replied, examining a logbook that had been left open on a nearby table. Listen to this. Patient 347, day 12 of treatment. Subject continues to resist therapy, increasing voltage to maximum setting. Note: patient has suffered 3 seizures during today's session but remains conscious. I turned away from the chart, feeling sick. But my flashlight beam fell on something even worse. A room filled with metal tubs, each one equipped with restraints and temperature controls. Ice bath therapy, Garrett explained. They'd force patients into freezing water for hours, sometimes days. The tubs were stained with rust and what looked like blood. Scratch marks around the edges showed where desperate fingers had clawed for escape. One tub still contained what looked like restraint chains anchored to the bottom. But it was the next room that truly horrified me. This one contained what could only be described as cages. Metal cells barely large enough for a person to sit upright. Each one had a small slot for food and a drain in the floor. The bars were worn smooth in places where hands had gripped them endlessly. A placard beside the entrance read, "Isolation Treatment Area. Violent and uncooperative patients." "They kept people in cages," I whispered. "For months at a time," Kevin added, reading from another logbook. "Some of these entries show patients confined for over a year." The walls around the cages were covered in writing, scratched into the concrete with fingernails or small stones. Names, dates, pleas for help. "Please let me go home." "I'm not crazy. Tell my mother I love her." And over again. "Help me, help me, help me." I was beginning to understand why Kevin's cousin had come back so shaken. This wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a monument to human cruelty, a place where suffering had been elevated to an art form. We left the treatment wing and found ourselves at a T intersection. To the left, signs pointed toward the cafeteria and kitchen areas. To the right, elevators and stairs led to the upper floors. Straight ahead was a large chalkboard, probably used for staff schedules or announcements. Without thinking, I walked over and wrote my name on it with a piece of chalk that had been left on the ledge. It seemed important somehow to leave evidence that I had been here, to add my name to the roster of people who had witnessed this place. But as soon as I finished writing, I felt a strange sensation, as if I had just done something irreversible, something that would mark me forever as having been here. I turned around to find Kevin and Garrett, and that's when I noticed the elevators. There were 3 of them, their doors standing open like gaping mouths. The elevator cars themselves were nowhere to be seen. The shafts dropped away into darkness, disappearing below the level of our flashlight beams. But as I walked closer to examine them, something impossible happened. The exit signs above the elevators flickered to life, casting an eerie red glow across the intersection. At the same time, emergency lighting along the corridors began to activate, creating pools of sickly yellow illumination that stretched away into the distance. "That's not possible," Garrett said, staring at the lights. "This place has been without power for 30 years. "Emergency systems," Kevin suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe they're battery-powered and something triggered them." I walked to the edge of one elevator shaft and shone my flashlight down. The beam disappeared into darkness without revealing the bottom. But as I stared into the depths, I could swear I heard something echoing up from below, a sound like metal scraping against stone. And then, as if responding to some unseen signal, every light in the visible part of the hospital suddenly blazed to life. The transformation was instant and terrifying. One moment we were navigating by flashlight through a dark, dead building. The next, harsh fluorescent lights were flickering to life throughout the hospital, revealing the full extent of the decay and destruction around us. But more than that, the lights revealed something else. We were not alone. Through the windows I could see vehicle headlights moving around the building's exterior. Bright beams swept back and forth across the grounds, clearly searching for something or someone. "Cops," Kevin whispered, grabbing my arm. "We need to hide, now." Panic hit me like a physical blow. Getting arrested for trespassing would mean jail time, court appearances, a criminal record. My parents would kill me. My college applications would be ruined. We scattered immediately, looking for hiding places. The intersection where we stood offered limited options, but we had to make do. Kevin dove behind a pile of overturned tables and chairs that had been stacked against one wall. Garrett, hampered by his injured knee, hobbled toward a doorway on the right side of the corridor and pressed himself into the shadows. I found myself directly in front of the open elevator shafts. Without thinking, I crouched down beside the opening, using the elevator framework to conceal myself from anyone who might come down the main corridor. The emergency lights continued to flicker overhead, casting dancing shadows that made everything seem to move. From my position, I had a clear view down the long hallway we had just traveled, but I was also painfully exposed if anyone approached from the other direction. We waited. The vehicle lights outside continued their systematic search, moving slowly around the building's perimeter. Through broken windows, I could see the beams sweeping across interior walls, probing every room, every hiding place. And then came the sounds. At first, I thought it was the police entering the building. Heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors, accompanied by the sounds of doors being opened, furniture being moved, objects being knocked over. The searchers were being methodical, checking every room, every possible hiding spot. But as the minutes passed, something about the sounds began to bother me. The footsteps seemed to come from multiple directions at once, not just from the entrance where we had come in, but from upstairs, from the other end of the building, even from below us. How many officers were there? And how had they gotten in so quickly? The sounds grew louder, closer. I could hear what sounded like metal gurneys being wheeled down corridors, their wheels squeaking in the familiar rhythm of hospital equipment. But that made no sense. There shouldn't be any gurneys left in working condition. Then I heard voices. They were distant, muffled, but clearly human. Multiple people talking, though I couldn't make out the words. The voices seemed to echo strangely in the building's corridors, bouncing off walls and returning changed, distorted. Kevin caught my eye and mouthed silently, "How many are there?" I shook my head. I couldn't tell. The sounds seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. 20 minutes passed. 30. The vehicle lights continued their patient circuit of the building, but the sounds inside seemed to be intensifying rather than diminishing. Whatever search was being conducted, it was thorough and getting closer. I was starting to cramp from crouching in the same position when something made me look down the hallway toward the area where we had found the patient files. A light was moving in that direction. Not a vehicle light from outside, but someone walking with a flashlight or lantern. The beam bobbed with the rhythm of footsteps, getting steadily brighter as it approached our location. I held my breath, pressing myself further back into the shadows beside the elevator shaft. The light was close now, maybe 50 feet away. I could hear the footsteps clearly, a steady measured pace that suggested someone who knew exactly where they were going. And then, as the light reached the intersection where we were hiding, I saw him. The figure that stepped into the intersection was impossible, but I saw it with my own eyes. He was dressed in a white coat that seemed to glow in the emergency lighting. Not the casual lab coat of a modern doctor, but the formal, lengthy coat of an earlier era. The coat was pristine, showing no signs of the dust and decay that covered everything else in the building. Beneath the coat, he wore a dark suit and tie, perfectly pressed. His hair was neatly combed and parted, held in place with what looked like hair tonic. Everything about him belonged to the 1950s or 1960s, as if he had stepped directly out of one of the old hospital photographs. He carried an old-fashioned medical bag in one hand and what appeared to be a patient file in the other. His face was calm, professional, showing the kind of detached concern I had seen in the faces of the doctors in those horrifying photographs. But his eyes were completely black. Not dark brown or deep blue, but black, as if the pupils had expanded to completely fill the iris, or as if there was simply nothing there at all. He walked out of the hallway and turned toward me, those terrible empty eyes scanning the intersection methodically. For a moment, I thought he was just looking around, conducting the same kind of search the police outside were performing. Then his gaze fixed directly on me. Even crouched in the shadows beside the elevator shaft, even partially concealed by the metal framework, he saw me. Those black eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made every nerve in my body scream. For what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, we stared at each other. The doctor's expression never changed. Calm, professional, mildly interested. As if finding a terrified teenager hiding in his hospital was exactly what he had expected. Then, slowly, deliberately, He raised both arms above his head in what might have been a gesture of surprise or triumph. The medical bag swung from one hand, the file from the other. His mouth opened as if he was about to speak, or perhaps call out to someone. But instead of speaking, he simply turned and walked away, heading down the corridor toward the cafeteria area. His footsteps echoed normally. His white coat disappeared into the shadows, and within moments, it was as if he had never been there at all. Except for the smell he left behind, the sharp, antiseptic odor of a working hospital, completely out of place in this tomb of decay and abandonment. I sat frozen in place, trying to process what I had just seen. My rational mind insisted it was impossible, a hallucination brought on by fear and the oppressive atmosphere of the place. But my eyes had seen him clearly, every detail sharp and unmistakable. After several minutes, I managed to whisper, "Did you guys see that?" Kevin's voice came back shaky. "See what?" "The doctor, the man in the white coat." "I didn't see anything," Garrett replied. "What doctor?" I described what I had witnessed, but even as I spoke, I could hear how insane it sounded. A doctor from the 1950s, walking the halls of an abandoned hospital, making eye contact with me before disappearing into the darkness. "You're freaking yourself out," Kevin said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This place is getting to all of us." Maybe he was right. Maybe the combination of stress, fear, and the horrible history we had been learning about had created some kind of waking nightmare. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew I wanted out of this place immediately. "We need to leave," I said. "Now. I don't care about the police." But even as I spoke, I realized the sounds inside the building had stopped. The footsteps, the moving furniture, the distant voices, everything had gone silent. The vehicle lights outside were still making their circuit, but whatever search had been conducted inside the hospital seemed to have ended. "Maybe they gave up," Garrett suggested hopefully. We waited another 10 minutes in silence, but the internal sounds didn't resume. Finally, Kevin made the decision for all of us. "We're turning ourselves in," he said. "This is getting too weird, and I'd rather deal with the cops than spend another minute in here wondering what else we might see." None of us argued. Whatever curiosity had brought us here was completely overwhelmed by the need to escape. We made our way back through the hospital corridors, retracing our path toward the window where we had entered. The emergency lights were still on, making navigation easier but also casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that made the decay and destruction even more horrifying. As we walked past the room where I had found Catherine's diary, I could swear I heard something. A soft crying sound, like someone sobbing quietly. But when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. The treatment room seemed even more sinister in the harsh light. The electroshock machine's metal components gleamed dully, and the ice bathtubs looked like instruments of torture from some medieval dungeon. I found myself walking faster, eager to put distance between myself and the evidence of human cruelty we had discovered. When we reached the waiting room where we had first entered, I was surprised to see that the wheelchair in the center of the room had moved. It was now facing the window we had climbed through, as if positioned to watch our exit. "That wasn't like that before," I said, pointing to the wheelchair. Kevin shone his flashlight on it. "Are you sure?" I was sure, but I didn't want to argue. I just wanted out. We reached the window, and Kevin climbed through first, dropping down to the ground outside. I went next, grateful to feel fresh air on my face and to be free of the oppressive atmosphere inside the building. Garrett was just starting to climb through when a powerful light suddenly blazed in our faces, temporarily blinding us. "Don't move!" a voice shouted. "Keep your hands where I can see them!" A police officer emerged from the shadows, his flashlight beam fixed on us. He was alone, which surprised me. Based on all the vehicle lights we had seen, I had expected multiple officers. He directed us to line up against the wall of the building while he called for backup. As we stood there, hands against the brick, I finally got a good look at our captor. He was young, probably not much older than us, and he looked nervous. His uniform was rumpled, and his flashlight beam shook slightly as he held it on us. "Are there any others with you?" he asked. "We need to know if anyone else is inside." "No, it's just us three," I replied. "Why, did you find someone else?" The officer's expression was puzzled. "We heard people moving around in there for the past hour. Doors slamming, furniture being moved around. If it wasn't you guys, then who was it?" Kevin, Garrett, and I exchanged glances. "We heard it too," Kevin said slowly. "We thought it was you searching for us." The officer shook his head. "We never entered the building. We just drove around the perimeter with our spotlights, trying to get whoever was inside to come out voluntarily." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the night air. "You never came inside?" I asked. "No. Department policy. That building's too dangerous, structurally unsound, asbestos, lead paint. We're not authorized to enter unless there's an immediate life-threatening emergency." "Then who was making all the noise?" The officer was quiet for a long moment. "You really want to know what I think?" We nodded. "I think that place is haunted as hell. Every officer in this county has stories about Waverly. Lights turning on by themselves, sounds of people moving around inside, figures in the windows. We've had dozens of calls over the years from people who swear they've seen things." "What kind of things?" Garrett asked. "Doctors making rounds, patients in the windows, people in old-fashioned clothes walking the halls." He paused. "You see anything like that in there?" I thought about the doctor with the black eyes, the white coat that glowed in the emergency lighting, the way he had looked directly at me before walking away. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I saw something like that." The officer nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. "You're not the first. Probably won't be the last either." Backup arrived a few minutes later, and we were processed for trespassing. The charges were minor, community service and a fine, but the experience had shaken all of us deeply. Years later, I learned that our experience at Waverly Sanitarium had not been unique. The building had gained a reputation as one of the most haunted locations in the country, with dozens of paranormal investigation teams documenting similar encounters. I also learned more about the building's history. The tuberculosis sanitarium had indeed been a place of death and suffering, but the mental hospital years had been even worse. Patients had been subjected to experimental treatments, illegal drug trials, and procedures that amounted to torture. Many had died, not from their mental illnesses, but from the treatments meant to cure them. The basement level that I had wanted to explore was eventually investigated by professional paranormal researchers. They found evidence of procedures that had never been officially documented: isolation cells, surgical suites for unauthorized experiments, and holding areas where patients had been kept for months without any record of their presence. The doctor I had seen matched descriptions given by other witnesses over the years. Always in the white coat, always carrying the medical bag, always with those terrible black eyes. Some researchers believed he was Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the hospital's chief psychiatrist during the 1950s and 1960s, who had committed suicide in his office after being investigated for patient abuse. But I didn't need researchers to tell me what I had experienced. I knew that Waverly Sanitarium was more than just an abandoned building. It was a repository of human suffering, a place where pain and death had soaked so deeply into the walls that they could never be completely erased. I drive past the hospital sometimes when I'm in that area, usually on my way to visit family. The building still stands, though it's more deteriorated now. The windows are all boarded up, and the grounds are completely overgrown. But sometimes, especially on dark nights like Devil's Night, I can still see lights moving in those windows. And I know that somewhere inside, in corridors that smell of antiseptic and despair, the doctor is still making his rounds, still carrying his medical bag, still searching for patients who need his particular brand of treatment. The living have abandoned Waverly Sanitarium. The dead never left. November 12, 2024. The woods of northern Michigan had always been my sanctuary. At 36, I'd spent nearly 2 decades tracking deer through these forests, learning their patterns, respecting their territory. This particular hunting trip wasn't meant to be different from the dozens before it. I'd arrived at my cabin 3 days earlier, settling into the familiar routine of early mornings and patient waiting. That morning, I woke before my alarm, the darkness outside my window complete. The temperature had dropped overnight, and my breath formed small clouds as I prepared my gear in the pre-dawn chill. Weather reports predicted clear skies, perfect visibility, but a sharp drop in temperature by evening. I layered methodically: thermal underwear, wool socks, camouflage pants, and a heavy jacket. My hunting rifle, a Remington 30-06 passed down from my grandfather, felt reassuring in my gloved hands. The drive to my preferred hunting spot took 40 minutes along dirt roads that grew increasingly narrow. I parked at the trailhead, checked my supplies one final time, and began the trek to my stand. The forest welcomed me with its morning symphony, twigs snapping beneath my boots, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze, distant birds announcing the coming day. This early, the woods felt clean, untouched, like I was the first human to ever walk these paths. My stand was positioned on the edge of a clearing with a good line of sight in 3 directions. I'd built it myself 5 seasons ago, sturdy enough to withstand Michigan winters and comfortable enough for the long wait hunting demanded. Climbing up, I settled in for what I knew could be hours of stillness. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I remained motionless, controlling my breathing, becoming part of the landscape. My thoughts drifted as they always did during these waits: work problems, family matters, the mortgage payment due next week. The meditation of the hunt always cleared my mind, reset my perspective. By midday, I'd spotted 3 does, but none offered a clean shot. I munched quietly on the sandwich I'd packed, sipped water sparingly, and continued my vigil. The temperature held steady, but I noticed dark clouds gathering on the western horizon, contradicting the forecast. Weather in northern Michigan was notoriously unpredictable, especially in November. I briefly considered packing up early, but dismissed the thought. I'd come for a reason. As afternoon wore on, the forest grew quieter. The birds that had chattered all morning fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Experienced hunters recognize these moments, the lull before activity. I raised my binoculars, scanning the tree line methodically, when a movement caught my eye. A buck, moving cautiously into the clearing, pausing to test the air. I froze, barely allowing myself to breathe. Even from this distance, I could count the points on his antlers. A 5-pointer, mature but not ancient. His coat was healthy, muscles defined beneath brown fur. He took another cautious step forward, and I slowly, deliberately, raised my rifle. The crosshairs settled on the buck's vital area, just behind the shoulder. My finger rested lightly on the trigger, not yet applying pressure. Time stretched as I observed him through the scope, his ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear, nostrils flaring to catch any scent of danger. I'd been taught to respect what I hunted. My father's words echoed in my mind. When you take a life, you accept responsibility for that decision. The buck lowered his head to graze, offering the perfect shot. I exhaled slowly, squeezing the trigger with practiced precision. The report of the rifle shattered the silence. The buck jerked, took 2 stumbling steps, and collapsed. A clean shot, the kind hunters pray for, minimizing suffering. Relief flooded through me. followed immediately by the solemn acknowledgement of what I'd done. I waited 15 minutes, making sure the animal was truly down before descending from my stand. The clearing felt different as I approached the fallen deer. Shadows had lengthened considerably, and I realized with a start how quickly daylight was fading. The clouds I'd noticed earlier had advanced, blocking the western sky entirely. My watch read 4:15 p.m., giving me maybe an hour of good light. Under normal circumstances, that would be plenty of time to field dress the deer and begin the trek back. Kneeling beside the buck, I removed my hunting knife from its sheath. The animal's eyes were already glazing over, the warmth of life rapidly departing. I whispered a quiet, "Thank you," before making the first incision, another tradition passed down from my father. The field dressing was methodical work, requiring focus and respect. I removed the internal organs carefully, preserving what was useful, leaving the rest for the forest's scavengers. By the time I finished, darkness was approaching faster than I'd anticipated. The clouds had swallowed what remained of daylight, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. I wiped my knife clean, returned it to its sheath, and considered my options. The deer was substantial, probably 180 pounds, and I was 5 miles from my truck. I'd brought my game cart specifically for this purpose, but it was secured about 2 miles away, at the junction where several trails met. I secured my rifle across my back and began dragging the deer through the underbrush toward the cart. This was the grunt work of hunting, the part glamorized hunting shows never depicted. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold, muscles in my back and shoulders protesting the strain. The forest around me had transformed with the approaching night, familiar landmarks taking on unfamiliar shapes in the diminishing light. I paused to catch my breath, suddenly aware of the profound silence. No birds called. No squirrels rustled through branches overhead. Even the wind had stilled, leaving the forest in an unnatural hush that made the hair on my neck stand up. I told myself this was normal. Animals sense death and grow quiet. But something felt off about the quality of the silence, like the forest wasn't just quiet but actively listening. Shaking off the sensation, I continued dragging the deer. My headlamp created a tunnel of light that seemed to make the surrounding darkness even more impenetrable. Every few minutes, I stopped to adjust my grip and check my bearings. The path back to the cart wasn't marked, but I'd traveled it enough times to navigate by memory and the occasional familiar tree or rock formation. When I finally reached the junction where I'd left the cart, exhaustion had set in. My shoulders ached, and my gloves were slick with a mixture of blood and sweat. The cart stood where I'd left it, a simple two-wheeled contraption designed to make transporting game easier. I allowed myself a moment of relief. The hardest part was over, or so I thought. I hoisted the deer onto the cart, securing it with bungee cords and rope. The weight distributed evenly, I gripped the handles and began pushing forward. For about 50 yards, everything went smoothly. The wheels turned easily over the relatively flat terrain, and I picked up pace, eager to reach my truck before complete darkness enveloped the forest. The sharp crack came without warning. At first I thought I'd run over a branch, but the sudden tilt of the cart told me something more serious had happened. I stopped, shining my headlamp down to inspect the damage. The left wheel had fractured along its rim, the spokes splaying outward like broken fingers. As I watched, helpless, the wheel gave one final groan and detached completely, leaving the cart listing dramatically to one side. "Damn it," I muttered, my voice unnaturally loud in the silent forest. I crouched to examine the brake more closely. The aluminum wheel had sheared clean through where it connected to the axle. A catastrophic failure with no quick fix. My mind raced through potential solutions. Could I fashion a replacement from branches? Drag the cart on its remaining wheel? Neither option seemed viable. The reality of my situation began to sink in. I was 3 miles from my truck, with night falling rapidly and a 180-pound deer that now had to be transported without mechanical assistance. My phone showed no service bars, not surprising in this remote area. No one knew exactly where I was hunting, only that I'd be somewhere in this general forest. No one would miss me until tomorrow at the earliest. I stood, stretching my back as I considered my options. I could abandon the deer, an unthinkable waste that went against everything I believed about hunting ethics. I could try making camp and waiting until morning, but I hadn't brought sufficient overnight gear, and the temperature was dropping fast. The only reasonable choice was to continue toward the truck, carrying the deer if necessary. With grim determination, I unstrapped the deer from the useless cart. Using the rope I'd brought, I fashioned a crude harness that would allow me to drape the animal across my shoulders, distributing the weight as evenly as possible. The technique, often called the fireman's carry, was something I'd learned years ago but rarely had to employ. With a grunt of effort, I lifted the deer, adjusting it until the weight settled as comfortably as possible across my upper back. The first 100 yards were manageable, adrenaline masking the strain. But soon my muscles began to protest, and my pace slowed. Sweat ran down my back despite the cold, and my breath came in increasingly labored puffs. I focused on the path ahead, forcing myself to take one step after another, knowing that stopping might mean not starting again. That's when I heard it. A single distant howl that cut through the silence like a knife. I froze, listening intently. Coyotes were common in these woods, typically hunting in small packs, especially in winter when food was scarce. A moment later, another howl answered the first, then another, until a chorus of yips and calls echoed through the trees. My grip tightened instinctively on the deer. The blood and viscera I'd left behind at the field dressing site would attract predators. That was part of the natural cycle. But the sounds seemed closer than they should be. Coyotes rarely posed a threat to humans, but I was alone, burdened, and increasingly vulnerable as darkness descended. I resumed walking, faster now despite the weight. The blood from the deer had soaked into my jacket, and I knew the scent was broadcasting my presence to anything with a keen nose. The howls continued, sometimes fading, sometimes growing louder, as if the pack was moving in patterns around me. Were they tracking me specifically, or was this regular hunting behavior? The rational part of my brain insisted it was the latter, but primal fear suggested otherwise. The forest had become an alien landscape. My headlamp created distorted shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees casting them. Every fallen log resembled a crouching predator. Every rustle in the undergrowth signaled approach. The weight of the deer grew heavier with each step, but the thought of putting it down, even temporarily, filled me with dread. Instinct told me that stopping now would make me vulnerable. The coyotes' calls had organized, becoming more purposeful. Where before they had sounded scattered and random, now they moved in what seemed like a coordinated pattern. I'd hunted and tracked enough to recognize the sounds of animals on a hunt. They were communicating, positioning themselves, working as a unit. Sweat trickled down my face despite the biting cold. My breath formed clouds in the beam of my headlamp. The path ahead led through a section of forest I knew well in daylight. A relatively open area with sparse underbrush, followed by a gradual descent toward a swampy lowland. Under normal circumstances, I would have skirted the swamp entirely, taking a longer but drier route. Tonight, that wasn't an option. The direct path through the wetland was my best chance of reaching the truck before complete exhaustion set in. The howls suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise, filling the darkness with anticipation. I strained to hear anything. A twig snap, a rustle of leaves that might indicate where the pack had gone. Nothing. Just the sound of my own labored breathing and the occasional creak of branches overhead. I continued forward, each step deliberate, trying to minimize noise. The trees began to thin, and I found myself on the edge of the clearing I'd expected. Moonlight filtered through the clouds, providing just enough illumination to make out the silhouettes of trees on the far side. Crossing open ground felt dangerously exposed, but I had no choice. Halfway across the clearing, movement caught my eye. A swift, low shape darting between trees at the perimeter. I stopped, squinting into the darkness. Another shape moved, then another. My headlamp beam swung wildly as I tried to track them, revealing nothing but empty spaces where I was certain I'd seen movement. I quickened my pace, ignoring the burning in my thighs and the crushing weight across my shoulders. The opposite tree line seemed impossibly distant. Each time my foot struck the ground, pain shot through my overworked muscles. I was pushing too hard, too fast, but fear drove me forward. A sound behind me, the unmistakable patter of paws on dry leaves. I didn't turn, couldn't turn, my body locked in the singular focus of forward motion. More sounds joined the first, a symphony of rustling and soft footfalls that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. They were flanking me, using the same hunting techniques they would employ against any prey. I reached the far side of the clearing, plunging back into the relative cover of trees. No relief came with this milestone. The sounds of pursuit only intensified. My hand moved to the hunting knife at my belt, though I knew how pitiful a defense it would be against multiple attackers. My rifle, strapped across my chest under the deer, was essentially useless without time to unsling it and aim. The forest floor began to slope downward, signaling the approach to the swampy area. The ground underfoot grew softer, my boots sinking slightly with each step. Soon I would be in the true wetland, where movement would become even more difficult. Part of me wondered if I should change course, try for higher ground where I might have better footing. But that would mean deviating from the most direct route to safety, adding precious time to my journey. A yip sounded, much closer than before, followed by a chorus of responses. They were communicating again, coordinating. I realized with chilling clarity that they weren't just following me, they were actively hunting me. The weight of the deer, the blood soaking my clothes, my obvious vulnerability, all had transformed me from human, something they would typically avoid, into prey. The first step into the swamp proper sent cold water over the top of my boot. I grimaced but pushed forward, each footfall now accompanied by a sucking sound as the mud attempted to claim my feet. The deer across my shoulders felt like it had doubled in weight, the strain threatening to buckle my knees. My breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the cold night air. The swamp stretched before me, a patchwork of shallow pools, tussocks of grass, and the occasional stunted tree. In daylight, I could have picked out the firmest path through this maze. In darkness, with only my headlamp illuminating a few feet ahead, I was forced to test each step, sometimes sinking ankle deep, sometimes finding relatively solid ground. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit grew more brazen. A splash, then another. The pack had followed me into the wetland without hesitation. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. My headlamp caught the reflection of eyes, several pairs gleaming with predatory focus. They were spread out in a loose semicircle, some wading through water, others picking their way along higher ground. I turned forward again, fighting panic. The rational part of my brain still insisted that coyotes rarely attacked humans, that they were naturally cautious creatures. But nothing about this felt natural. Their behavior was too coordinated, too persistent. And I was not simply a human now. I was a walking blood scent, burdened and slow, broadcasting vulnerability with every labored step. My foot caught on something beneath the water, a submerged branch or root, and I stumbled forward. For one terrible moment, I thought I would fall face first into the muck, pinned beneath the weight of the deer. Through sheer determination, I regained my balance, but the near fall cost me. Pain shot through my ankle, not severe enough to indicate a break, but certainly a sprain. Each step now brought a fresh wave of agony. The swamp seemed endless, a nightmare landscape of identical pools and deceptive footing. My headlamp battery was weakening, the beam growing dimmer. I switched it to the lowest setting, conserving what power remained. This reduced my visibility even further, forcing me to move more by feel than sight. A splash to my right, much closer than the previous sounds. I swung toward it, catching a glimpse of gray-brown fur as a coyote darted behind a clump of reeds. They were testing distances now, gauging my reactions. Another splash to my left, then behind me. They were circling, closing the distance gradually, their confidence growing with each passing minute. I fumbled at my belt, unsheathing my hunting knife. The blade gleamed dully in the fading headlamp beam, 6 inches of steel that suddenly seemed woefully inadequate. Still, holding it provided some psychological comfort, a connection to humanity and tool use that separated me from the pure animalism surrounding me. The ground beneath my feet began to firm slightly. I was nearing the far edge of the swamp. Hope sparked briefly, only to be extinguished by a sudden chorus of yips and howls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound was triumphant, celebratory almost, as if the pack was acknowledging that their prey was tiring, weakening. I pushed forward with renewed desperation, ignoring the fire in my muscles and the throbbing in my ankle. Water gave way to mud, then to damp earth, as I finally reached the border of the wetland. Under different circumstances, I would have stopped here, rested, perhaps even celebrated this small victory. Now I barely registered the transition, focused only on maintaining distance from the creatures behind me. The terrain began to rise gradually. I was approaching a ridge that I knew ran parallel to the road where I'd parked my truck. If I could reach the top of that incline, I would be less than a mile from safety. The thought gave me strength I didn't know I still possessed. A growl, low and menacing, sounded from my right. Much too close. I swung toward it, knife extended, and saw a coyote less than 10 feet away. In my headlamp's weakening beam, it looked larger than I remembered coyotes being, its eyes reflecting an eerie, almost intelligent malice. It stood its ground as I faced it, neither advancing nor retreating. Movement to my left drew my attention. Another coyote, matching the first in size and demeanor. Then another appeared, and another, until I realized with stomach-dropping clarity that I was surrounded. The pack had maneuvered me exactly where they wanted, using the swamp to tire me out, waiting until I reached drier ground where they could move more effectively. I turned in a slow circle, knife extended, trying to keep as many of them in view as possible. There were at least 8 that I could count, possibly more hidden in the darkness beyond my light's reach. They maintained their distance, watching, waiting. For what, I wasn't sure, but the coordination of their behavior sent ice through my veins. The standoff couldn't last. My strength was failing rapidly, the weight of the deer threatening to bring me to my knees. The coyotes sensed this, their postures changing subtly, muscles tensing in preparation. One of them, slightly larger than the others, the alpha, I presumed, took a deliberate step forward, testing my reaction. I lunged toward it, shouting hoarsely, swinging the knife in a wide arc. The coyote retreated, but only a few steps, its retreat seeming almost contemptuous. The message was clear. They knew I was at my limit. They could afford to wait. My mind raced, searching for options. I couldn't outrun them, not in my current state. Fighting was suicide against so many. The deer across my shoulders was both burden and attractant, but abandoning it might not save me now. They had committed to this hunt. The scent of blood was on me regardless. The ridge rose before me, steeper than I remembered. If I could reach the top, would it make any difference? The coyotes could easily follow. But something in my primal brain insisted that higher ground was better, that elevation might provide some advantage I couldn't yet see. I began backing toward the incline, keeping the knife extended, trying to watch all directions simultaneously. The pack adjusted, maintaining their circle, neither advancing nor yielding ground. Each step backward was agony, my ankle protesting, my shoulders screaming from the sustained weight. The alpha made another testing advance, this time joined by two others. I shouted again, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the trees. They paused but didn't retreat as far this time. My bluff was losing effectiveness with each repetition. I reached the base of the ridge and began the ascent, still facing outward, still trying to keep the pack in view. The incline forced me to lean forward against the weight of the deer, throwing my already precarious balance further off. Twice I nearly fell, catching myself at the last moment, knowing that going down might mean never getting up again. The coyotes followed, maintaining their distance but adjusting their formation to account for the changing terrain. Their patience was unnerving. This wasn't normal predatory behavior. They moved with purpose, with strategy, as if guided by something beyond animal instinct. Halfway up the ridge, my headlamp flickered, then died. Darkness engulfed me, broken only by the weak moonlight filtering through clouds. I froze, momentarily blinded by the sudden absence of light. When my eyes adjusted, I could make out only vague shapes where the coyotes had been, darker patches against the night. A growl from my right spurred me back into motion. I scrambled upward, abandoning caution, driven by pure survival instinct. My foot slipped on loose soil, and I went down on one knee. Something brushed against my leg, fur, warm and coarse. I slashed blindly with the knife, connecting with nothing but air. I regained my footing and continued upward, no longer trying to face the threat, simply focused on ascent. The top of the ridge was close now, a slightly lighter line against the night sky. What lay beyond, I couldn't remember clearly, but it had to be better than my current position. Another brush against my leg, this time followed by a sharp nip that didn't quite penetrate my pants. They were testing, tasting, their restraint eroding with each passing moment. I kicked out reflexively and connected with something solid that yelped in surprise or pain. The sound triggered a response from the others. Growls deepened, movements became more aggressive. They were done waiting. The hunt was entering its final phase. I reached the top of the ridge in a last desperate surge of energy. As I crested the rise, the landscape ahead became visible in the weak moonlight. My heart leapt. There, not 50 yards away, stood a chain-link fence, tall and solid, marking the boundary of private property that bordered the state forest. Beyond the fence, I could make out the straight line of a gravel access road. New energy flooded my limbs. The fence represented a barrier the coyotes would have to work to cross. Not an insurmountable obstacle for them, but something that would slow them down, break their coordinated approach. More importantly, the road beyond might have traffic, might lead to help. I half ran, half stumbled toward the fence, abandoning any pretense of facing my pursuers. Behind me, the pack gave voice to their hunt, howls and yips signaling the chase was on in earnest. They were no longer hiding their intentions, no longer content to simply follow and wear me down. The fence loomed larger, 7 feet of chain link topped with a strand of barbed wire. Under normal circumstances, scaling it would be challenging but manageable. With a deer across my shoulders and exhaustion clouding my thoughts, it seemed nearly impossible. But the alternatives, turning to fight or surrendering to exhaustion, were unthinkable. I reached the fence as the first coyote closed to within striking distance. Without hesitation, I heaved the deer upward, using the last reserves of my strength to lift it high enough to catch on the top of the fence. The carcass balanced precariously for a moment, then toppled over to the other side with a heavy thud. Hands now free, I began to climb, fingers gripping the metal links, boots searching for purchase. Behind me, snarls and snapping jaws spurred my ascent. Something caught at my pant leg, teeth tearing at the fabric. I kicked wildly, connecting with a solid mass. The grip released, and I continued upward. My jacket caught on the barbed wire at the top, the sharp points piercing the fabric and scraping against my skin beneath. I yanked free with a ripping sound, sacrificing the jacket's integrity for speed. As I cleared the top, a coyote leapt upward, jaws snapping just inches from my dangling boot. I tumbled to the other side, landing hard on the packed gravel. The impact drove the air from my lungs, leaving me gasping. The deer lay nearby, a dark mass against the lighter gravel. On the other side of the fence, the pack converged, some already beginning to climb or probe for weaknesses in the barrier. I scrambled to my feet, retrieved my knife from where it had fallen, and backed away from the fence. The coyotes snarled and paced, some attempting to squeeze through gaps at the bottom, others testing the height with leaps that fell just short of the top. The fence was holding for now. I collapsed to my knees on the gravel road, lungs burning, muscles trembling with exhaustion. The coyotes continued their assault on the fence, their frustration evident in their increasingly frenzied movements. One particularly large individual had managed to get halfway up the chain link, claws scrabbling for purchase on the metal. I watched, mesmerized by its determination, wondering if the barrier would truly prove sufficient. After what seemed an eternity, but was likely only minutes, the attacks on the fence began to subside. The coyotes paced back and forth, occasionally testing the barrier, but with decreasing conviction. Their howls took on a different quality. Less hunting fervor, more frustrated lamentation. They had lost their prey, and some primal part of me exulted in that knowledge. When I felt capable of movement again, I turned my attention to the deer. The carcass lay where it had fallen, still intact despite the rough handling. My ethical obligation remained. This animal deserved to be properly processed, its meat not wasted. With trembling hands, I checked the integrity of the bungee cords I'd originally used to secure it to the cart. The road stretched in both directions, disappearing into darkness. I had no idea which way might lead to civilization sooner, or if this road connected anywhere near where I'd parked my truck. My phone still showed no service. I was safer than I had been in the forest, but far from secure. I decided to move east along the road, a choice based more on instinct than knowledge. The deer was once again a burden across my shoulders, though it seemed almost manageable now compared to carrying it through swamp and woodland while being hunted. My ankle throbbed with each step, and every muscle in my body protested. But the relative safety of the road provided psychological comfort that translated to physical endurance. After perhaps half a mile, lights appeared in the distance, the unmistakable glow of headlights moving toward me. I stepped to the side of the road, not wanting to present a hazardous obstacle to the approaching vehicle. As it drew closer, I raised one arm in a clear gesture of distress. The vehicle, a pickup truck with official markings, slowed, then stopped altogether about 20 feet away. Headlights illuminated me, creating a spotlight effect that must have presented a strange tableau. A blood-stained man with a deer across his shoulders, standing on a deserted gravel road in the middle of the night. The driver's door opened, and a figure emerged, approaching cautiously. As they drew closer, I made out the uniform of a Department of Natural Resources officer. Relief flooded through me, so intense it nearly brought me to my knees again. "Sir, are you all right?" The officer's voice held concern tinged with wariness. His hand rested near his sidearm, a reasonable precaution given the circumstances. "Yes, no, I'm not injured, but I've had..." I struggled to find words that wouldn't sound deranged. There was a pack of coyotes. They chased me through the forest. My game cart broke and I had to carry the deer. They were hunting me. The officer's expression shifted from wariness to something more complex. doubt mixed with growing concern. He gestured to the deer. "May I see your hunting license and tags?" The normality of the request almost made me laugh. After everything that had happened, here was bureaucracy, rules, civilization reasserting itself. I carefully lowered the deer to the ground and retrieved my wallet with hands that still trembled slightly. The officer examined my documentation, nodding as he confirmed everything was in order. He shone his flashlight over the deer, noting the clean shot placement and field dressing. His professional assessment complete, his demeanor softened. "You're about 3 miles from the main road," he said, gesturing in the direction I'd been walking. "Were you hunting alone?" I nodded, suddenly aware of how foolish that decision seemed in retrospect. "And the coyotes, how many would you estimate were in the pack?" "At least 8, I answered. "Maybe more. They worked together, like they were coordinating. I've never seen behavior like that before." The officer nodded thoughtfully. "We've had reports of unusually aggressive packs in this area over the past month. Larger groups than normal, bolder behavior. Theory is that habitat loss further north has pushed multiple packs into overlapping territories, forcing them to adapt new hunting strategies." He gestured to his truck. "Let's get your deer in the back. I can drive you to your vehicle, assuming you can direct me to where you parked." The offer was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Together, we loaded the deer into the truck bed, securing it with additional straps the officer provided. As we drove through the night, I directed him toward the trailhead where I'd left my truck hours earlier. The forest looked different from inside the safety of a vehicle. Less menacing, more familiar. But I knew something had changed in my perception of these woods. They were no longer simply a place of recreation and sustenance. They had shown me their other face, the one that humans, for all their technological advantages, would do well to remember. Dawn broke as I finally arrived home, the deer secured in the bed of my own truck. The night's terror had faded somewhat, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion and a strange, almost euphoric gratitude for survival. I mechanically went through the process of hanging the deer in my garage, ready for proper butchering later. Every movement felt dreamlike, disconnected from normal reality. I stripped off my ruined clothes, noting with detached interest the numerous small tears and punctures in the fabric, evidence that the encounter had been as close as I'd perceived, not some fear-magnified imagination. In the shower, hot water revealed scratches and bruises I hadn't even registered receiving, my body a map of the night's journey. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and plagued by dreams of pursuit, of endless running through terrain that constantly shifted beneath my feet. I woke repeatedly, heart pounding, certain that I could hear howls in the distance. By mid-afternoon, I gave up on rest and instead focused on processing the deer, a task that normally brought satisfaction, but now felt like an obligation to be completed. The meat from the deer would feed me for months, vacuum-sealed and stored in my freezer. I found myself wondering if the price had been worth it. Not in the economic sense. Venison was far cheaper than purchasing equivalent amounts of beef, but in some deeper calculus of risk and reward. What had I truly gained, and what had I nearly lost? Over the next few days, I researched coyote behavior obsessively, looking for explanations for what I'd experienced. Most sources confirmed what the DNR officer had suggested. Habitat pressure was creating new pack dynamics, forcing adaptations in hunting strategies. Some researchers documented increased pack sizes and more coordinated attacks on larger prey. None of this was reassuring. I called my brother, who had hunted these same woods with me for years before moving out of state. I related the experience, trying to keep my description factual, resisting the urge to embellish what had already been terrifying enough in its reality. "God," he said when I finished, "you're lucky to be alive. Are you going out again this season?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't considered whether the experience had changed my relationship with hunting permanently. I don't know, I answered honestly. I'm not sure I can look at those woods the same way. No one would blame you for hanging up the rifle after something like that, he offered. But that felt like surrender to something I wasn't prepared to acknowledge, that beneath our veneer of civilization, we remain potential prey. That nature tolerates our presence but doesn't recognize our presumed dominance. That the line between hunter and hunted is thinner than we care to admit. A week later, I returned to the forest. Not to hunt, the season was closing, and I had more meat than I needed, but to walk the same paths in daylight, to reclaim some sense of control over an environment that had so thoroughly stripped it from me. I brought a companion this time, my neighbor's German Shepherd, a muscular animal whose alert presence beside me provided both practical security and psychological comfort. We walked to the clearing where I'd shot the deer, then followed approximately the same route I'd taken during my desperate flight. Everything looked different in daylight, less threatening, more navigable. The swamp that had seemed endless at night was a relatively modest wetland, easily traversed on slightly higher ground I hadn't been able to see in darkness. When we reached the fence that had provided salvation, I stood for a long time, looking back toward the forest. The dog whined softly, sensing something in my manner that made him uneasy. I reached down to reassure him, fingers running through thick fur, feeling his solid warmth against my leg. "It's okay," I told him, though the words were really for myself. "We're just visiting. We don't belong here." That was the truth I'd discovered during that night of terror. Not that nature was malevolent, but that it was indifferent. We enter wild places as guests, not masters, regardless of the weapons we carry or the technologies we employ. The forest doesn't care about our intentions or our ethics. It operates by older, deeper rules that we forget at our peril. I would hunt again, I decided as we turned to head back. But never alone. Never without proper communication equipment. Never with the comfortable arrogance that had led me into danger. The venison in my freezer was more than meat now. It was a reminder of lessons learned at great cost, of respect earned through fear, of boundaries re-established between human and wild. As we walked away from the fence, I thought I heard a distant howl. The dog's ears pricked forward, confirming it wasn't imagination. I didn't hurry my steps or look back. The sound wasn't a threat now, just a voice in a conversation that had been ongoing long before humans entered it. A conversation about survival, territory, and the ancient dance between predator and prey that defines all living things. I was no longer just a hunter. I had been hunted. And something fundamental had shifted in how I understood my place in the world. Not a revelation exactly, but a remembering of something humans had known since we huddled around the first fires, watching the darkness beyond our circles of light, listening to the sounds of things that moved in the night. My name is Alton Merton, and this happened during a job that was unlike any other. For most of my life, I worked for a secret cryptid hunting unit within the U.S. government. It's a job that sounds ridiculous until you're the one standing toe-to-toe with things that shouldn't exist. I always figured the job would end one of two ways. I'd retire quietly, or I'd vanish into the wilderness, becoming one of the many missing persons our unit tracks. I never thought I'd live to tell this story. The call came in on a Tuesday. I remember because I just settled into my apartment after wrapping up a case in northern Michigan. Something about livestock mutilations that turned out to be coyotes with unusual hunting patterns. Nothing supernatural, just nature being brutal in new ways. I was 3 sips into my first decent bourbon in weeks when my secure phone buzzed. "Merton," I answered, already reaching for my go bag. "We need you in Oregon, yesterday." It was Director Holloway, her voice tight with the particular strain that meant civilians were already dead. 12 hours later, I was stepping off a military transport at a small airfield near the Cascade Range. The late September air carried the first bite of autumn, and fog clung to the forest like a shroud. We were dispatched to the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, a place where the trees rise like giants and the fog rolls in thick, swallowing the world whole. The mission was straightforward on paper. Reports of missing hikers had spiked in the region, more than usual, and some of the recovered remains bore signs of violent death, signs that didn't match any known predator. My team consisted of me, our tracker Sam Powell, a stoic guy with a knack for finding anyone, anywhere; Jane Harper, our weapon specialist who could hit a target at 100 yards without blinking; and our tech wizard, Max Lang, who handled everything from satellite phones to drones. We were a tight-knit group, each of us having saved the other's skin more than once. Sam met me at the airfield, his weathered face grim beneath his salt and pepper beard. 6 missing in the last month, he said, handing me a folder as we walked to the waiting jeep. 2 bodies recovered. The rest... He trailed off, letting the implication hang. Jane and Max were already at the ranger station, converting a back room into our operations center. Jane was methodically cleaning her rifle, her movements precise and mechanical. Max hunched over 3 laptops, satellite imagery flickering across the screens. The latest victim is Emily Dawson, Max said without looking up. 32. Experienced hiker, local guide. Went out for a day hike 4 days ago and never came back. I studied the map they'd pinned to the wall, red pins marking the last known locations of the missing, blue ones where bodies had been found. No discernible pattern, except they all disappeared within a roughly 20-square-mile area. Any connections between the victims? I asked. Jane shook her head. Different ages, backgrounds, experience levels. Only thing they have in common is they all went missing in the same general area. What about the bodies? I asked, dreading the answer. That's where it gets interesting, Max said, pulling up photos I wish I could unsee. Medical examiner found puncture wounds that don't match any known predator. Spacing's all wrong for bear, cougar, or wolf. And there's this. He zoomed in on what looked like strange markings around the wounds. Almost like the tissue was dissolved. We spent the rest of the day prepping gear and studying topographical maps. As darkness fell, I stepped outside the station, watching as the mist thickened into impenetrable fog. The forest seemed to breathe in the darkness, ancient and patient. Something was out there, hiding in that primeval wilderness. Something that had developed a taste for human flesh. And tomorrow, we were going hunting. We set up base camp near the last known location of Emily Dawson. She had been an experienced trekker, familiar with the dangers of the wilderness. Her disappearance had raised more than a few eyebrows. As I zipped my tent closed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever lurked in these woods was already aware of our presence. I checked my sidearm before lying down, finding cold comfort in its weight. Sleep came in fitful bursts, punctuated by dreams of moving shadows and distant, inhuman cries echoing through endless trees. We started our search at dawn, the forest still shrouded in mist, our breath visible in the crisp morning air. Sam took point, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of passage. Jane flanked our right, rifle at the ready, while Max monitored our location and deployed small reconnaissance drones to scout ahead. The forest felt wrong somehow. Too quiet. Too still. The towering Douglas firs and ancient cedars created a cathedral-like space, their branches interlacing high above to block out most of the sunlight. What little made it through created dappled patterns on the forest floor, shifting like liquid as the wind stirred the canopy. Park ranger said Emily was headed to Blackwater Ridge, Sam said, consulting his GPS. It's about 4 miles northeast of here. Popular spot for photographers because of the view. We moved in silence, each of us scanning our surroundings. My skin prickled with the sensation of being observed. though whenever I turned to look, there was nothing but trees and undergrowth. Hours passed with nothing to show for our efforts. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to indicate where Emily might have gone. The landscape became increasingly rugged, forcing us to navigate steep ravines and dense thickets of thorny brush. "Something's off," Jane muttered as we paused to check our bearings. "We should have seen some wildlife by now. Squirrels, birds, something." She was right. The forest was unnaturally silent, as if the local fauna had fled or gone into hiding. It wasn't until the afternoon that we found something. A scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush, stained with blood. Sam examined it closely, his face grim. "This is recent," he said. "Less than a day old." Max bagged the sample while Jane documented our location. I scanned the surrounding area, looking for any other signs of disturbance. "There," I said, pointing to a faint depression in the loamy soil. "Looks like something was dragged." Sam crouched, studying the ground with practiced eyes. "Good catch. Direction is..." He pointed deeper into the forest, away from the established trails. "That way." We pressed on, the mood somber. The forest grew denser, the undergrowth thicker, making progress slow and arduous. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of leaves. The temperature dropped noticeably as we descended into a narrow valley. The soil grew damp beneath our boots, and the vegetation changed from sunlight-loving ferns to mushrooms and moss that thrived in darkness. It was around then that I noticed something odd. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping birds, chattering squirrels, had ceased entirely. An unnatural quiet had settled in, as if the very air was holding its breath. "Something's not right," Jane muttered, her eyes scanning the trees, rifle raised slightly. We moved cautiously, weapons at the ready. The tension was palpable, every step measured, every sense straining for the slightest hint of danger. The trail of disturbed earth and occasional blood smears led us deeper into the valley, to a place where the trees grew so close together that we had to move single file. The ground sloped sharply downward, and the air grew colder still, carrying the mineral smell of underground water and wet stone. That's when we stumbled upon the cave. It was hidden behind a thick curtain of vines, its entrance yawning like a black hole against the hillside. If not for the trail we were following, we might have walked right past it. "Think this is where our missing hikers ended up?" Max whispered, his voice barely audible. "One way to find out," I replied, unclipping my flashlight. The entrance was roughly 8 feet high and twice as wide, with strange weathering patterns that made the rock look almost like it had been melted rather than eroded. The ground in front showed signs of frequent passage. Not human footprints, but something else. Something that dragged itself along the ground. Max deployed a small drone, sending it inside to scout the area. We huddled around his tablet, watching the grainy night vision feed as the drone penetrated the darkness. The feed showed a narrow tunnel leading into a larger chamber, the walls marked with strange, almost ritualistic carvings. They didn't match any cultural pattern I recognized. Not Native American, not European, not anything human. "I need to get a closer look at those markings," I said, checking my sidearm. "This place gives me the creeps," Max muttered. "Stay sharp," I told them. "We go in, we document, we get out. No heroics." "I'll go first," I said, taking point. The cave was cold and damp, the air heavy with the scent of decay. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing more of the eerie carvings. They depicted creatures that were neither human nor animal, grotesque amalgamations that defied logic. Some showed scenes of hunting, others of feeding. All featured the same elongated skeletal figures pursuing prey. The narrow entrance tunnel widened after about 50 feet, opening into the chamber we'd seen on the drone feed. The ceiling rose to at least 20 feet, creating an echoing space large enough to hold dozens of people. We reached the chamber, and the stench hit us like a physical force. The unmistakable odor of decomposing flesh, so strong it made my eyes water. As our lights swept the space, the source became clear. Bodies, or what was left of them, were scattered around. Some were recent, others in varying stages of decomposition. It was a gruesome sight, enough to churn even the strongest stomach. "Dear God," Jane whispered, covering her nose and mouth. I counted at least 8 distinct corpses, some partially consumed, others seemingly preserved for later consumption. Among the newer remains, I spotted hiking gear that matched the description of Emily Dawson's equipment. Max began documenting the scene, his camera flashing as he took photographs for evidence. Sam moved carefully around the perimeter, examining the ground and walls. "These markings," he said, tracing a weathered hand over one of the carvings. "They're old. Very old." As we inspected the remains, noting details for our report, a sound echoed through the cave, a scraping noise like claws on stone, coming from deeper within the mountain. We turned as one, flashlights sweeping the chamber. At the far end, previously hidden in shadow, a narrow passage led further into the earth. And from that passage, a figure emerged. It was tall, emaciated, with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed faintly in the light. Its skin was a mottled gray, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth, too many to fit in what approximated a human jaw. The creature moved with a jerking, insect-like motion that sent primal fear coursing through my veins. We fired without hesitation, bullets tearing through the air. The muzzle flashes were blinding in the darkness, the reports deafening in the confined space. The creature moved with unnatural speed, dodging most of our shots. It let out a shriek that reverberated through the cave, making my ears ring. A sound like metal scraping against metal, amplified to painful levels. "Center mass!" I shouted, adjusting my aim. Jane managed to land a hit, and the creature stumbled, black ichor spraying from its shoulder. But it didn't fall. Instead, it seemed enraged, its movements becoming more frenzied and unpredictable. "Fall back!" I shouted, retreating towards the tunnel. "Sam! Max! Go!" They didn't need to be told twice. Sam and Max were ahead, Jane close behind. I brought up the rear, firing controlled bursts to keep the creature at bay. My rounds found their mark, punching through the thing's torso, but it kept coming, seemingly impervious to wounds that would have dropped any natural predator. As we reached the tunnel entrance, the creature lunged, crossing the distance between us with impossible speed. Its claws raked across Jane's back, tearing through her tactical vest like it was tissue paper. She cried out, collapsing to the ground. "Jane!" Max yelled, turning to help her. But the creature was on her in an instant, its elongated fingers wrapping around her throat, lifting her off the ground. I emptied my magazine into it, each impact causing it to twitch but not deterring it. "Get out!" Jane managed to gasp, her hands scrabbling at the thing's grip. She reached for something on her belt, a grenade. I grabbed Max, pulling him back as the creature tore into Jane. "She's giving us a chance," I hissed. "We have to go, now!" We retreated down the tunnel, the sounds of struggle fading behind us. Then came a muffled thump that shook dust from the ceiling. Jane had pulled the pin. We burst from the cave, gasping for air. The daylight was blinding after the darkness of the tunnel. Sam was already calling for extraction, his voice steady despite the chaos. We didn't stop moving until we reached the relative safety of our camp, putting distance between us and whatever might emerge from that cave. "Did you see that thing?" Max wheezed, hands on his knees as he fought to catch his breath. "What the hell was it?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Nothing in our database matches that morphology." "Jane." Sam's voice broke. She knew what she was doing. We fell silent, each processing the horror we'd witnessed and the loss of our teammate. The extraction team arrived within the hour, but it was too late for Jane. Her sacrifice had bought us time to escape, but the weight of her death pressed down on us like a physical force. Back at the ranger station, we debriefed with Director Holloway via secure video link. Her face remained impassive as we described the creature and the cave of horrors it had made its lair. The markings suggest it's been there a long time, I explained. Generations, maybe centuries. Local legends mention shadow stealers that take people who venture too deep into the forest. And you're certain the explosive eliminated the threat? Holloway asked. No, I said honestly. The tunnel partially collapsed, but we can't confirm the creature was neutralized. If it survived, it's trapped for now, but caves like that often have multiple exits. Holloway's expression hardened. I'm sending in a containment team. They'll seal the cave system and monitor for any activity. What about Jane? Max asked. Official report will list her as killed by a bear attack during a wildlife survey, Holloway replied. Her family will receive full benefits and commendations for service to her country. The loss weighed heavily on us all, a stark reminder of the dangers we faced. The creature, whatever it was, remained an unsolved mystery lurking in the wilderness. I couldn't shake the image of its glowing eyes, the way it moved with such unnatural precision, the fact that our bullets seemed to merely inconvenience it. In the aftermath, we reported back to our superiors, detailing the events as best we could. The official story was that Jane had died in a bear attack, a convenient lie to cover the truth. I didn't like it, but it wasn't my call to make. We were given some time off, a chance to recover and regroup. I spent those days in quiet reflection, haunted by the memories of that cave and the creature that dwelled within. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for its next victim. The world is full of dark, hidden corners, places where the light of civilization doesn't reach. We're the ones sent to explore those places, to confront the monsters that lurk in the shadows. In the end, we're just human, facing things we were never meant to understand. But we do it because someone has to. We do it because the alternative is to let the darkness win. And as long as I'm still breathing, I'll keep fighting, no matter the cost. That's the job. That's the reality of hunting monsters. 3 weeks after the incident, I sat in a sterile conference room at headquarters, a cup of cold coffee forgotten in front of me. Director Holloway had called us in for what she termed a follow-up briefing, but I suspected there was more to it. Sam and Max looked as haggard as I felt. None of us had been sleeping well. The dreams were always the same, running through endless tunnels while something scuttled behind us, gaining with every step. The containment team completed their work, Holloway began without preamble, sliding folders across the table. The cave has been sealed with reinforced concrete and the area declared off-limits due to geological instability. I opened the folder to find photos of the operation. Heavy machinery, hazmat suits, armed guards maintaining a perimeter. The final image showed the cave entrance completely blocked, steel rebar protruding from the concrete like skeletal fingers. Did they find anything? I asked. Any sign of... Jane's remains were recovered, Holloway interrupted, her voice softening slightly. As for the entity, there was no trace. Either it was destroyed in the explosion or it escaped, Sam finished, his face grim. Holloway nodded. We've stepped up surveillance in the area. Motion sensors, thermal imaging, regular patrols. If it's still out there, we'll find it. What about the markings? Max asked. Did the team document them before sealing the cave? Holloway pushed another folder toward us. Our linguists and anthropologists have been analyzing the symbols. They don't match any known human language or pictographic system. The photos showed the strange carvings in detail, angular glyphs and disturbing figures that seem to shift and move even in the static images. Looking at them for too long made my head ache. Their preliminary assessment is that these markings predate human settlement in the region, Holloway continued. Carbon dating of organic material embedded in the deeper carvings suggests they're at least 15,000 years old. So whatever that thing was, it's been there a long time, I murmured. The question is whether it's unique or if there are more of them, Sam added. The thought had been haunting me as well. If one such creature could exist, hidden from human discovery for millennia, how many others might be out there? We're cross-referencing similar disappearances nationwide, Holloway said, as if reading my thoughts. Looking for patterns that might indicate other entities with similar hunting behaviors. And Emily Dawson? I asked. Her family deserves closure. Official report lists her as presumed dead, body unrecoverable due to predator activity, Holloway replied. Her parents were told a mountain lion was responsible. More lies. More cover-ups. Sometimes I wondered if we were doing the right thing, hiding the truth from the public. But then I remembered the panic that would ensue if people knew what really lurked in the dark corners of the world. As for Emily Dawson, her fate remained a mystery. Her body wasn't among those in the cave, leaving a small, bitter hope that she might still be out there, alive. We added her to the list of missing persons, another name in a file that seemed to grow longer every day. The unit moved on to the next case, always one step behind the things that go bump in the night. We never talked about Jane after that. Not directly. But her memory lingered, a silent reminder of the price we pay for standing between the world and the darkness. 2 months later, I was back in the field, investigating cattle mutilations in Oklahoma that turned out to be the work of a cult rather than anything supernatural. The work continued, an endless cycle of reports, investigations, and containment. But my thoughts often returned to that cave in Oregon, to the creature with too many teeth and eyes that glowed in the dark. I checked the surveillance reports weekly, looking for any sign that it had returned. The winter passed, then spring. The forests of the Pacific Northwest bloomed with new life, covering the scars of our encounter. Hikers returned to the trails, unaware of the danger that had once stalked those woods. I began to hope that perhaps we had succeeded after all, that Jane's sacrifice had not been in vain, that the creature had been trapped or killed in the explosion, its ancient hunger finally extinguished. Then came the call that shattered that fragile hope. 3 hikers missing near Mount Jefferson, Director Holloway said, her voice tight. 2 bodies recovered. The injuries matched the pattern. My blood ran cold. Mount Jefferson was over 100 miles from our original encounter. It's moved, I said, already reaching for my go bag. Or there's more than one. Team is assembling at the Portland field office, Holloway replied. Wheels up in 3 hours. I've seen things that defy explanation, faced horrors that would break most men. But it's not the monsters that haunt me. It's the people left behind, the missing and the dead, their stories unfinished. In the quiet moments when the world is still and the night is dark, I hear their whispers. And I know that as long as there are monsters, there will be hunters like me ready to face them. That's the job. That's the reality. And it's a reality I've come to accept. The helicopter set down in a clearing not far from the base of Mount Jefferson. The mountain loomed above us, its peak shrouded in clouds, indifferent to the horror unfolding in its shadow. Sam and Max flanked me as we disembarked, each carrying more firepower than we had in Oregon. We weren't taking any chances this time. A local ranger met us, his face drawn with stress and lack of sleep. 3 days ago, a group of 5 hikers went up the East Trail, he explained as we loaded our gear into a waiting jeep. Only 2 made it back. They were hysterical, talking about something coming out of the trees, something that moved wrong. And the bodies? I asked. Found yesterday, about 4 miles up the trail. It's not pretty. The ranger wasn't exaggerating. The scene was eerily similar to what we'd found in the cave months earlier. Bodies partially consumed, strange puncture wounds, tissues around the wounds showing signs of chemical decomposition, as if the creature's saliva contained some sort of digestive enzyme that liquefied flesh. Same MO, Sam confirmed, crouching beside one of the bodies. But this is fresh. Less than 24 hours. It's hunting, Max said quietly, and getting bolder. We established a base camp and began our search, methodically covering the area where the attacks had occurred. The forest here was different from the dense coastal woods of our previous encounter, more open with less undergrowth, offering fewer places for something large to hide. Yet the sense of being watched was even stronger, a constant prickling at the back of my neck that made me twitch at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. Night fell, and we continued our search by spotlight and thermal imaging. Max had developed a new drone with enhanced infrared capabilities, designed specifically to detect the unusual heat signature we'd recorded from the creature. "I've got something," he said around midnight, hunched over his tablet. 300 yards northwest, moving parallel to the ridgeline. We moved in formation, weapons ready, communication limited to hand signals. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light through the trees and creating pools of deep shadow that seemed to shift and move. The drone's feed showed the heat signature growing stronger, more defined. Whatever we were tracking was large, at least 7 feet tall, and moving with the same jerky, insect-like motion I remembered all too well. "Visual contact," Sam whispered, pointing ahead. There it was, moving between the trees, the same elongated limbs, the same mottled gray skin. It was dragging something behind it, a dark mass that left a wet trail on the forest floor. "On my mark," I breathed, raising my rifle. 3, 2... The creature stopped suddenly, its head swiveling in our direction. Those glowing eyes seemed to look directly at me, through me, into some part of myself I didn't know existed. And then it was moving, not away from us as expected, but directly toward us, covering ground with impossible speed. "Fire!" I shouted, and our weapons erupted in unison. This time, we were better prepared. Incendiary rounds punched through the creature's torso, igniting on impact. It shrieked, that same metal-on-metal sound that haunted my dreams, and thrashed wildly as flames spread across its body. But still it came, burning and wounded, driven by hunger or rage or some alien emotion we couldn't comprehend. It crashed into our line, sending Sam flying with a sweep of its arm. Max emptied his magazine into it point blank, the muzzle flash illuminating its grotesque face in stark relief. I circled behind it, drawing my sidearm loaded with special hollow points filled with white phosphorus. I emptied the clip into the back of its head, each impact causing a small explosion of searing white light. The creature collapsed, its limbs twitching and spasming. Black ichor pooled beneath it, hissing and steaming where it touched the ground. "Is it dead?" Max asked, reloading with shaking hands. "Not taking any chances," I replied, removing a thermite grenade from my pack. "Back up." The grenade detonated in a blinding flash, engulfing the creature in flames hot enough to melt steel. We watched in grim silence as it burned, the stench of it acrid and alien. When the flames finally died down, nothing remained but a blackened smear on the forest floor and a few fragments of bone-like material that refused to burn. "Bag those," I told Max, pointing to the fragments. "Full containment protocol." We recovered the item it had been dragging, the partial remains of one of the missing hikers. The poor soul hadn't stood a chance against such a predator. As dawn broke, we swept the area one final time before calling in the cleanup team. The official story would be a forest fire caused by illegal campers, explaining the scorched earth and any lingering evidence of our confrontation. "You think that's the end of it?" Sam asked as we watched the containment team work. his arm in a sling from his encounter with the creature. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe it was the same one from Oregon, maybe it was another of its kind. Either way, there could be more out there. If there are, we'll find them, Max said with uncharacteristic fierceness. For Jane. I nodded, surveying the mountain wilderness stretching to the horizon. So much territory, so many places for things to hide. And beyond these forests, there were deserts and swamps, mountains and plains, oceans and caves, countless environments where the unknown could lurk, watching and waiting. Back at headquarters, the fragments we recovered were sent to a specialized lab for analysis. Preliminary results confirmed what I had suspected. The material matched nothing in our databases, its molecular structure unlike any known terrestrial organism. The question remains, Director Holloway said during our debriefing. Are these isolated incidents, or are we seeing the beginning of a pattern? If they're coming out of hiding, there must be a reason, I pointed out. Environmental changes, human encroachment on their territory, something triggering more aggressive behavior. Or maybe they've always been hunting us, Sam suggested quietly, and we're just getting better at noticing. The thought chilled me. How many missing persons over the centuries, over the millennia, might have fallen prey to these creatures? How many unexplained disappearances might have been attributed to accidents or exposure, when something far more sinister was responsible? In the weeks that followed, we compiled reports of similar attacks and disappearances, creating a map of potential hotspots across the country. Patterns emerged. Clusters of incidents around certain mountain ranges, deep forests, remote coastlines. Places where the boundaries between our world and whatever lay beyond seemed thinnest. We became more proactive, deploying teams to investigate areas before people went missing, setting up monitoring systems, working with local authorities to restrict access to high-risk locations without revealing the true nature of the threat. It wasn't a perfect system. People still disappeared. Bodies were still found bearing those distinctive wounds. But we were learning, adapting, becoming more effective hunters of the hunters. As for me, I continued to lead field operations, each mission adding to our knowledge, each encounter honing our tactics. The nightmares became less frequent, replaced by a cold determination to protect those who would never know the dangers that lurked in the shadows. I've spent my life in pursuit of things that shouldn't exist, standing at the border between the known world and the mysteries beyond. It's a lonely existence, marked by secrets and loss, by questions that may never be answered. But when I think of the alternative, of these creatures roaming unchecked, of families never knowing what happened to their loved ones, I know the cost is worth paying. So I keep my go bag packed, my weapons loaded, my mind open to possibilities that most would dismiss as impossible. I watch the shadows, listening for sounds that don't belong, always ready for the call that will send me back into the darkness. Because that's who I am. That's what I do. I'm Alton Merton, and I hunt the things that hunt us.